Welcome to Global Ecommerce Leaders podcast. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I am Jim Okamura.
What happens when a geopolitical flashpoint halfway around the world suddenly impacts your freight costs, your inventory strategy, and your customer promise? On this episode, we tackle one of the biggest emerging threats facing global brands and retailers, the ripple effects of conflict in the Middle East, rising fuel costs, shrinking air capacity, and rapidly shifting compliance requirements. Joining us back on the podcast, Livingston's Jes Crownover, and for the first time, Livingston's Patrick Riley with a clear message. Supply chain disruption is no longer an exception. It's the operating environment. If you're selling across borders, this conversation could save you millions. And by the way, if you're in the LA area and you're a brand or retailer that is part of the Gulf community or are deeply involved in global e-commerce, join Jim and me for a networking and thought leadership dinner in LA on Wednesday, May 13th, presented by Livingston and Global E. Get in touch with Jim or myself to learn more today. Well, Jes, welcome back to the podcast, and welcome, Patrick. How are you both doing today?
Wonderful.
Jes, where are we finding you? Patrick, where are we finding you?
I am back in Memphis, Tennessee right now.
And you've been doing a lot of traveling, so that's a rare thing at this time of the year, right?
It really is.
And you're where, Patrick?
Norfolk, Virginia.
Norfolk, Virginia. Isn't there like a big naval base there? Why do I know Norfolk?
It's the largest in the world.
You know, Jes, last time we spoke, and it feels like an age ago, it feels like a minute ago. I think it was actually before the outbreak of it was pre-Iran war. So we wanted to get you back on the microphone for some early thoughts on implications and strategies for retailers and brands that are doing business globally. And Patrick, we wanted to roll in your expertise and perspectives as well. So, you know, first, for those who missed our last episode and maybe the half dozen people who don't know you, Jes, who are you and what do you do for a living?
I'm Jes Crownover. I'm the VP of Ecommerce and Digital Solutions for Livingston. What that means is I own e-commerce for Livingston. So across all the different areas, if it involves e-commerce, it involves me. I'm also the entity holder with CVP for our U.S. e-commerce business.
All right. And Patrick, what about yourself? What do you do? What do you do at Livingston? And what's your background? Tell us a little about your story.
Sure. Yeah. So Patrick Riley with Livingston International. I've been with Livingston now for just over 4.5 years. I'm the director of North American Ecommerce. I lead the commercial activity for U.S. and Canada e-commerce at Livingston. My role really sits at the intersection of customs, compliance, transportation, and cross-border execution. So I spend a lot of my time helping brands, retailers, marketplaces, consolidators think through not just how to move the product, but how to keep it compliant, landed, and profitable, especially when policy or disruption changes almost overnight.
Well, and how did you come to this role? Were you always interested in logistics? Did you, retail has been sometimes described as the accidental profession, but how did you find yourself doing what you do?
You know, I started out in 2008, working for a 3PL that I launched in Richmond, and then shortly thereafter, I went to go work for the railroad. Did consulting and starting in 2017 after the railroad. And then Livingston called me, and here I am doing e-commerce cross-border. Never thought I'd get here, but here we are.
Well, great. Let's kind of jump right in. Jes, let's start with first order implications of the Iran war and the resulting closing of the Strait of Hormuz. What are you already seeing or expecting in terms of, freight cost spikes, bunker, fuel surcharges, and just carrier behavior in general in reaction to what's happening in the Middle East?
Sure. I mean, I think if you take it from a really high level, 50,000 foot view, many of these disruptions resemble structural shifts rather than short-term blips. And I say that because the global freight market was already operating with limited spare capacity. Ocean capacity was weighing on carrier earnings, depending where you're from. While there's aging aircraft fleets, there was limited delivery with constrained air capacity. So you take the combined effect of rising freight costs, longer routes, and constrained capacity, it's dragging right across the global value chains across many sectors. In terms of increasing costs, container rates and tanker freight indices have jumped sharply, especially as the traffic plummets from the Strait. Insurers have very quickly raised premiums for vessels entering conflict zones. That is typical and has proven true in this case. There's also a tremendous amount of freight volatility. So the risks associated with transiting the Gulf of Hormuz have pushed carriers to avoid the main Gulf traffic lanes or they've had imposed war risk surcharges. So some major lines are rerouting vessels via the Cape of Good Hope. And just that alone adds 14 days, typically 10 to 14 days of transit times. And it shrinks effective capacity because the longer these vessels are on the ocean, they can't get back to reload and to be able to have that capacity open again. So the longer transit times inherently create decreased capacity, right? And then on top of that, you've got air freight tightening. So as the ocean timelines become unpredictable, either you take a longer route or you don't know when it's going to go through. You have time-sensitive goods especially. And that includes electronics, pharmaceuticals, automotive parts. All of these are migrating to air freight. And there was already a tightening of belly space. There's further tightening of belly space. It drives the rates up higher. You're seeing that especially on key Asia, Europe, and Asia, North America corridors. So these lanes have shot up. There's not much space comparatively, and it's still going on. So we're not going to see any reduction of that. It's going to take a long time to back out of it because you've kind of got a lot built up, and it's going to take a longer time to alleviate all of these delays and the cost escalations. Additionally, fuel prices have spiked. Some carriers have been forced to implement significant surcharges to cover costs. In China, some logistics companies that have e-commerce cargo, they're stranded in the Middle East, and companies moving transshipment hubs to places such as Doha in attempts to evade route disruptions are still facing delays and broader cost escalations. So all of this is just an ecosystem, and it's like the perfect storm with all of the increasing costs, the delays, the demand, everything together is increasing it. And so it's going to take a long time to back out of this buildup.
And I think that's what we're certainly, hearing from the retail community at large, with the lag effect in terms of how this, may be affecting prices that the consumers, see. But certainly what you're describing, explains, again, the complexity of this ecosystem and how long it will take to kind of recover, from this perfect storm, as well. I noticed Lufthansa announcing some of their commercial flight, price increases, for this summer, and certainly expect to see a lot more of that.
And Patrick, let's talk about air freight. What did Jes call it? Belly space? That's a great industry term. But Jes touched upon it. But let's really focus in and hone on air freight. What are you seeing around, this shift from ocean to air? It's got to be a bit more expensive to move that product, but there's some trade-offs. How should retailers and brands be thinking about prioritizing when, all these kind of global echoes of this problem start to resonate across the world?
Yeah, I'd say that we're seeing brands and retailers selectively go after airspace, right? And so they're not broadly replacing ocean with air because the economics just don't work at scale, right? So what we are seeing is we're seeing the brands and retailers really kind of do what we would call triaging. They're pushing the high margin, launch critical, stock out sensitive or even customer promise SKUs into the air while leaving the lower velocity products at the ocean or delaying a launch altogether. And so we look at how do they prioritize this, right? And see, they should be looking at air as, that's the panic button, right? They need to use it as a portfolio strategy. They need to really segment their inventory into 3 separate buckets. We'd call that revenue critical, brand critical, and deferrable. Whereas, the air is the first bucket, your split mode is the second, if needed, and then you protect your cash on the third. And I think that's where we're seeing brands and retailers kind of focus on it, and that's where we're kind of leaning towards them. We don't want them to say, hey, we got to push everything into the air, because it doesn't make sense. A lot of brands, retailers that are pushing, fast fashion, air can work because it's quick and it's fast, and they're used to moving in air. But if you're looking at larger, heavy products or lower margin products, air is not the option, especially now, as Jes mentioned. Fuels are rising, costs are up. You're exactly right, Jim. We're flying back and forth to Europe this year, and our costs have skyrocketed since we booked. So we're definitely seeing the push already, right, from the consumer side.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about, on the last episode, Jes talked about compliance complexity and that it was rising. And what are you seeing? I mean, quickly with these, sanctions come, sanctions go. It feels like quickly a supplier or a shipment could become non-compliant. And what does that move for goods in motion? This is so dynamic. You usually have months, and months are much more time to plan. How are you and the customers experiencing that right now?
You hit it right there, right? A shipment and supplier can become non-compliant really overnight if sanctions lists change, an owner or an affiliate is added, a vessel raises red flags, a route starts touching restricted counterparties. And the key is that compliance is not something you validate a booking and just forget. It has to be monitored throughout the life of the shipment. So that's the big thing. And I think a lot of companies are so used to saying, the forwarder has it, it's done, and I don't have to worry about it. No, you need to follow this, and they need to follow it, right? And I think a lot of forwarders are so used to just, it's booked, it's done, we'll see it in 3 weeks, make sure the ISF's done, right? And now you need to really focus on every part of that movement, right? And I think that's where visibility comes into play throughout the whole span of that shipment.
And Jes, do you expect retailers to, as we think about all these connecting forces, do you expect retailers to start rethinking? Kind of reminds me of the COVID era, right? Start rethinking about flexibility. Do you build buffer buffer inventory? What was it? It wasn't. It used to be. Where retailers were thinking about just in time. I think they what was the phrase people were using? Just in case, build up some larger inventories. And can the balance sheets absorb that? And again, what are you hearing from your customers as this working capital shifts around? How are you hearing about reactions to that?
We're starting to see some of that pivoting. There's a duality there because you're paying so much in duties and taxes. Do you really want to, do you have the cash flow to be able to do that? Some can, some cannot. So it's an investment right now to be able to bring it in. And then if it doesn't sell, then you have to deal with reverse logistics, and maybe you're not set up for that yet. And maybe you don't have a process for it. And a lot of brands and retailers do not. So there's this tempering of being afraid to move too much. It's not in the same situation. It's still in between the JIT and the JIC, just in time and just in case. There's somewhere a sweet spot there where you're not bringing too much in, because during the pandemic, you had ET 86, 321 in the US and de minimis is starting to go away in other countries. So you have to be careful about bringing too much over and basically impacting your cash flow negatively to offset having the inventory in place. So we're seeing some are doing it, some are looking into it. It's still, some are just still on the fence about it. I think, first of all, reverse logistics hasn't really reached its full potential. I think the estimated market share of, the market size of reverse logistics is close to $1 trillion. I think it was supposed to be $936 billion this year. And there's a single digit growth rate, but it looks like all of these external factors in this perfect storm, so to speak, with the closing of the Strait is pushing retailers and brands to really look at adopting faster practices to be a part of the circular economy. I'm fresh back from Nordics, a cross-border forum that was held in Stockholm, and it was loud and clear that maximizing this is in the forefront of many brands and retailers' pending strategies. You've got rising focus on sustainability and cost reductions that are a part of this. There's companies like Zigzag and Swap and others that have a strong focus on maximizing the value. But I think the brands and the retailers are finally understanding that they're going to have to pivot and do a little bit different. You've got the front end that's gotten the strong focus, and now the back end is becoming just as important. You've got consumer confidence waning. It's been waning all year long, and the economic realities aren't getting any brighter. So there's only so much you can address on the front end. However, there's so much opportunity to get cost backs, whether it's being able to resell it in a different country or being able to get duties and taxes back with duty drawback. Duty drawback has been the hottest topic that we've come across. I think Patrick can attest to this. Every single call that we have, duty drawback is a part of it, because the back end of looking at where they can have reductions in costs, many brands and retailers really haven't maximized this area, and they're starting to pivot and ask questions and start to look at it. I think in the US with the IEPA refunds in full swing, they're starting to realize maybe I can get it back in other areas. And that's very valid and something that they should explore, honestly.
Jess, I'm glad you brought up, things like the duty drawback and the refunds, that a lot of retailers are eligible for. It's something that, we feel like, a number of them are still trying to figure that out. And so a good, prompt for those two. Again, I have talked to a retailer recently who were really building in that refund, as part of how they're going to fund their programs, this year. So certainly some are on top of it, but we certainly know others can use a little more help. Patrick, I wondered if you can talk a little towards, how you are advising global brands today. What does a war resilient supply chain, look like, over the long term? Obviously, short term, there is a bit of a reaction to, again, sanctions on and off and so on. But what are the things that, any globally ambitious, retailer or brand, should be thinking about in terms of whether it's data visibility or regionalization or something else, entirely? How are you guys advising some of your clients?
I'd say a war resilient supply chain is not one that's going to predict every single disruption, right? That's nearly impossible. It's one that can really absorb the shocks without losing compliance margin and, more importantly, customer trust. The way I look at this is breaking it down into 4 pillars. More partner optionality. So that's more carriers, brokers, gateways, and even backup modes, right? We talked about air versus ocean. Better visibility. It's not just track and trace. That's easy. But integrated order, inventory, routing, compliance, and landing cost visibility. I think that's pillar 2. Pillar 3 goes into the more recognition or regionalization where it makes sense, right? So think country cluster inventory strategies and diversified sourcing, right? So looking at your different sourcing, looking at where it makes sense to kind of regionalize and country cluster, right? So we saw a lot of this before the de minimis went away with a lot of Mexico. We're still seeing Mexico as a big player into the U.S. and Canada. So I think, country clustering that, or you look at Europe and do the same exact thing where you're focusing it on one single or 2 single hub areas and kind of doing a hub and spoke there. And the fourth, and I think this is probably the most important, I think Jes will smile on this, is compliance as a core infrastructure. It's continuous, it's embedded, it's monitored, and it's executive owned at the top level, right? I think that's one thing that's overlooked so many times over. They're like, I just want to get it to the market, however it gets there, right? And I think we really need to focus on, and brand and retailers need to really focus on ensuring that, they are compliant, right? Because it's, when you look at airspace, you're looking at capacity, and everybody else is trying to clamor after it. It's not going to be, the one that has the loudest voice to get the space. It's going to be the most compliant, the most organized shipper that gets that space.
It's what we've seen, over the past, really decade or so. But again, the supply chain leaders, the executives, really with a very important seat at the strategy table, which wasn't always the case, in the past. But these are such big issues that you're talking about here, that do require any senior leadership team to really wrap their arms around that and buy into it. Jes and Patrick, let's kind of wrap up here. Last words for both of you. Jes first, then Patrick. What's the one mistake retailers must avoid in preparing for geopolitical disruption that we're undergoing now? What should they be doing this quarter, not next year?
Brands are facing significant and connected risk headwinds impacting every part of the business. New geopolitical risk has injected a demand-side shock into a cost environment that was already under constraint. So I think the biggest piece of this is, and I have 3 steps to follow, but planned flexibility and redundancies, right? So there's something to be said for the adage of keeping calm and carrying on. If you don't have a strategic plan, develop one and stick to the plan and trust in its long-term potential. But that plan needs to include redundancy and flexibility. And what I mean by redundancy is having backups, making sure that you can pivot and making sure there's inherent flexibility in whatever you're planning, right? So we don't know what's going to happen next, but putting yourself in these scenarios and being able to plan ahead is incredibly important. So 3 steps to do that. One, just establish a regular cross-functional being important, risk review process. You want to identify and prioritize current and emerging threats to your value chain. And that will look different according to each brand retailer, depending on where they're manufacturing, where their markets are, et cetera. The second one is encourage your leaders to challenge assumptions and update these risks quarterly or even monthly to stay ahead of new developments. It's really easy to say, okay, we've mastered this challenge. There's always going to be new ones. So what I would say is pay attention. And even if it's a short period of time, take time to really challenge current assumptions to be able to understand where you might be able to mitigate risk, where you don't have redundancies, and how you would pivot in case something happens and puts that under risk. And then use industry benchmarking as the third in scenario planning to understand how these risks can impact your brand's operations and reputation and financial performance. You build up a launch and then you can't get it launched. That's reputational value that's damaged. Your financial performance to not be able to have the launches planned, et cetera. There's so many different things, whether it's a launch or whether it's just fulfilling orders on a regular basis, it matters not. You've got to have planned flexibility and redundancy.
That's great counsel. And again, applies. I could see how that would apply to any, company, really. Patrick, anything that you would like to add, in terms of what are the things that, any retailers, should be doing this quarter and not waiting till next year?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest mistake is treating a geopolitical disruption like a headline instead of an operating condition. If we wait for certainty, we're already too late, right? If brands and retailers are out there trying to figure out, okay, what do we do this quarter that's going to be different than last quarter that maybe gives us an edge for the rest of the year or moving forward to make this supply chain a little more resilient, it's map exposure by lane, supplier, carrier, and product margin, right? So pre-approve your contingency playbooks for rerouting or mode shifts and compliance escalation. Deciding now which SKUs and customers get protected first when capacity tightens, right? So planning this out further. You should review the sanction screening, frequency, and supplier vessel due diligence, right? So look deeper into who's the forwarder using, how's the shipping actually happening, and review those sanction lists. And I'd say the biggest one is pressure test landed cost assumptions. Line up your alternate transportation and customs options before you even need them, right? So really thinking way ahead and thinking, okay, if the broker fails, if something happens, who else can I call, right? You don't want to go back to an RFP while you have stuff that's really happening, right? So I think in the way we close this, is and don't prepare for the next exact crisis. It's building the muscles that let you survive any crisis.
Again, great advice, and certainly, we highly applaud, the retailers who are doing that type of, scenario planning so that they are prepared and they're not kind of caught on their heels, and really good advice, for anyone out there. Jes and Patrick, I really want to thank you both, for again, being on the Global Ecommerce Leaders Forum podcast series. We really appreciate the return, interview here just to talk about some of the war implications, and certainly we'll be watching this play out over the coming weeks and months. Let's see where this is all going, and again look forward to getting you back on the mic in the future. We will certainly be finding people can find you on LinkedIn and through the show notes that we'll have on the bottom. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure and give us that 5-star rating and follow us on your favorite podcast platform, and check out our newly refreshed YouTube and LinkedIn pages.